Interesting things can be done with character design and such if you present things in a slightly different way. Let's take a look at one example of that today. Hello, and thank you all for joining us in here today on Hessan's County for another TTRPG Talk. This video series takes a look at tabletop role-playing games related materials and discusses game design. And today we'll be doing that game design discussion, taking a look at a new SRD for our system reference document series. The one we're going to be taking a look at today, as I mentioned in our little brief intro, and also as you can probably see in the picture next to me, utilizes some different and unique elements to create a character. Specifically, it relies pretty heavily on a Venn diagram to help build out some of the basic structures and relationships and skills that exist within the game with your character. If you have followed or watched some of the other videos on my channel or taken a look at some of my own games, you might notice that this looks a little bit familiar. And that is because the basic concept of using a Venn diagram to help build your character has also informed some of my own game design and has basically kind of turned into the Blossom system that I still have yet to write a reference document for. But yeah, basically this is where I originally was introduced to that basic concept. Although there are some pretty significant differences between my own personal Blossom system and the way that VEN6 operates. One other thing that I should go ahead and mention is, as a part of that original exploration and the original development of Blossom, on my blog at my website on hessancounty.com, I did write about VEN6. So I'm not necessarily going to be covering all of the same material that I have here, but a good amount of it is going to be pretty similar. So if you want to read about it rather than watching it, you can definitely check that out. A link will be in the description down below. This was created by Jason Wahlberg of Live Reel Productions, originally back in 2001. I believe it released on itch in October of 2021, but I might be misremembering that. Anyway, so of course you can find it on itch, as you saw on the first page that we took a look at, but it is also hosted on their website. It's available free through itch, but it's also hosted on the Live Reel Press website at livereelproductions.com, and I will also include a link to this particular website down below this particular page, because it is available through a PDF on the actual itch page for this, but this is the most up-to-date, always updated version of the SRD if you wish to take a look at it yourself. This is a Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 unported license. Now, the unported might throw some people off a little bit, as well might the 3.0 part, because obviously a lot of the other things that we've discussed on this channel have been 4.0 international, right? Basically, there isn't that much of a difference between Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 unported and 4.0 international, because unported and international essentially means the same thing in this context. Unported basically means that we have a license that is as international and generic as possible, because ported means that we have made modifications to the license to make it specific to that country that we're writing the license for, specific for the actual the little sort of nitty-gritty legal details that we need to modify slightly to get it to fit better in that legal framework. 3.0 and 4.0, there are just some mostly minor changes that were made in between the two, mostly to sort of, strengthen and clarify some of the language, but at least from the standpoint of a user, there's not enough of a difference to really bother unless you're doing something unusual. The average TTRPG creator is not really going to need to worry about it that much of a difference between 3.0 and 4.0, at least in my experience. Keep in mind, obviously, I am not a legal expert. If you feel it necessary, you can, of course, consult a lawyer or read the license yourself. Why would I want to utilize VEN6 for my system? Well, we'll discuss some of the mechanics later, but the first thing I wanted to touch on was just the basic idea that this is intended to be as zero prep of a game as possible. First of all, although you can use the game with a game master, this is actually encouraged. You're actually encouraged not to necessarily utilize a game master in this game. So it's essentially whenever you come into a situation where a game master might be typically necessary, instead you can share out those responsibilities without the group, either equally or taking bits and pieces and kind of spreading them around everyone. So that's something that you do not necessarily need to. This is definitely more of a collaborative storytelling type of a system. So essentially, in many ways, this works very similar to a traditional role-playing game, many other traditional types of role-playing games, but in a way that encourages you to keep the story moving and also avoids the necessity to have somebody acting in the background to influence the story or kind of railroad things to tell a story. Instead, the story is being organically created at the table. So that's one way that this game really fits well for typically one-shots or very short story arcs. So this is not something that you would use to create a very long running system, unless it's like episodic in nature. Instead, this would be because you're the way the story is designed and the way the characters are designed, it's not necessarily super dynamic. In that, I mean, like your character is going to be evolving a lot over time. Instead, this is more cinematic. So don't think like 20, 30 episode series. Instead, think like a 2 or 3 episode miniseries or a long movie would be more towards the kinds of stories that you would be telling with this system. So obviously, if your story you're trying to tell fits that, then that's great, and this might work for you. If not, then you might need to potentially take a look at a different system, especially if you're looking at very long-term play, because there really isn't like a character advancement system. You could potentially make changes to your character, but there really isn't an advancement system per se. Jumping into exactly how this sort of works mechanically, Jason Wahlberg has created several character sheets that are also available on the system reference document page of their website. This is one that they created for using Google Sheets, which actually has a little page here that you can kind of modify what these traits say, and it will change what it says over here. You can't modify it directly. But either way, that's actually a very nice touch and makes it a little bit easier to actually fill out the character sheet. So as we take a look at the actual Venn diagram itself, you will notice that around the outside, we have 4 examples of a trait. And then where they overlap, we have 4 examples of a skill. So, again, on the outside, we have these 4 fundamental traits. These traits are just basically, again, the fundamental building blocks of your character. Taking a look at the system reference document, you will note here that there are a number of different defining characteristics, specifically physical, mental, or social characteristics that describe your character. When you're creating your character, you should have one trait that could be described as coming from each of these things. You need to have at least one physical, mental, and social trait. And then the 4th one can be from whatever. So coming back over here, we have our 4 traits, right? Now, the question is, where do these skills come from? Well, as you can probably imagine, based on the fact that it's a Venn diagram, we have overlap, right? Whenever you have an area of overlap between your 2 traits, this refines your character's abilities to the point where we develop a skill. Over here in the blog, I actually essentially built at least the traits and skills for a character, just to give you an example. So as you can see here, we have a character who is persuasive, ritualistic, athletic, and empathetic. Now, obviously, the location that you place these 4 traits is important because you're not going to be creating a skill for the trait that is opposite it on the Venn diagram. You're only going to be doing it for the 2 that are immediately adjacent. So that's something to keep in mind. And even taking the same 4 traits and rearranging their order could create a notably, not significantly, but notably different character. So here, for example, a connection between ritualistic and persuasive, I decided maybe this character has skill in religion, right? Connection between ritualistic and athletic, maybe this character is a martial artist. Athletic and empathetic means that, yes, they are, strong and physically active and ability and train a lot and stuff like that. But empathetic means that they connect well with others. So maybe this character also is a good trainer because they have both the physical abilities and know-how, but also the empathy to engage with others and, to teach. Then connection between persuasive and empathetic, we have negotiation. They're good at connecting with others and they're good at convincing people to agree with them, so they can use those 2 things together to, create a better outcome. One thing that's important to note is that in this game, we're going to be using D6s. Essentially, whenever you're doing an action that would fall under one of these traits, you will be rolling 2d6 and then adding together your pool to determine your final outcome. Whenever you're rolling something that a skill could apply to, you're adding an extra die, so you're actually rolling 3d6. So for, again, coming to this example, if my character was attempting to train another person in doing a certain thing, like punching, I don't know, then presumably they would roll a 3d6 to see how successful they are at assisting the other player. If my character was attempting to engage in some non-religious ritual, like some sort of social ritual that they're expected to know about, then they would probably roll a 2d6 because they're not super skilled in this particular area of ritual, but they are comfortable and familiar with the concept of having to engage in ritual as a part of life, and therefore they would roll 2d6. If we asked this character to cook a meal, then they'd roll 1d6 because they're not. This is not part of their life, or at least not. This is not a something that they're would be considered good at necessarily because of the various traits and skills that they have. One additional thing to add is that whenever you are doing an action where you're getting assistance from another character, you have managed to plan in advance and therefore have prepared for this particular action. Or if it's just something that's super epic and honestly, is you're really pushing the envelope, and honestly, you probably should, gain some extra assistance in this role just because it's, you're just doing something that's like the rule of cool, then you would gain an extra d6 for that. Once you've rolled your pool, whether you're rolling 1, 2, 3, or 4 dice, then you would add all of those together and compare it to a difficulty chart, whether you succeed or not. The difficulty chart runs from very simple actions, which are 3 or better. So basically, whenever you are rolling your dice, basically, even if you have no skills or anything traits that would apply to this action, you still have like a 2/3 chance of success. Up to 18 for really, really hard actions. But in between, we have practiced at 7, skilled at 10, and expert at 14. Although those are essentially a lot of the fundamental mechanics when it comes to deciding what happens, that doesn't mean that's the only things that you need to create when creating a character. Of course, as you can see, we also have all of this stuff over here that we haven't even touched on. Name is somewhat obvious, but an archetype is essentially kind of like, you know how in the cipher system where you make that sentence that kind of describes your character? This would be like the I am a it would be those kinds of two words. So, for example, earlier in the example that I made in the blog, where I had sort of like the wise old monk, I would probably write wise old monk as the archetype, or at least wise monk. I don't know about old. It would depend on this thing. And of course, description is somewhat obvious. However, there are of course some other elements we need to take a look at too. For example, here we essentially are encouraging that each character should have a goal, or each character needs to have a goal of some sort. This is kind of where you're going to. Another thing that we also should have is relationships. Whenever you are creating your character, and this is generally the basic concept, is that you're kind of creating this character at least a little bit, at least to a certain extent, collaboratively with your group, because this part requires permission from other players. So basically, you need to decide exactly how it is you kind of fit into the group. And once you've determined that, then you should set up 2 relationships about other players with, of course, their consent. Basically, you need to determine what the type of relationship it is between these people. Are they like teacher and student? Are they antagonistic with each other? Or do we even have like a bully and a victim? Or do we have like a are they lovers? Are they friends? Do they just happen to know each other? Were they like classmates, or they grew up in the same town together or something? Basically, this is kind of sort of the same basic idea of like, when you're playing your traditional D&D game where you're all sitting around in the tavern, what connected you before you sat down in that tavern? It's that kind of basic idea. And then finally, gear. This is not something that necessarily is mechanically important, although I could see potentially you having to happen to have a convenient piece of gear might potentially gain you an extra d6 when it comes to that sort of rule of cool thing we mentioned earlier, or potentially preparation. But the basic idea is just that you're just kind of coming up, what's a list of things that would make sense for my character to have. Making sure, of course, that the items that you're talking about are cinematically relevant. This is essentially a game system that's really trying to recreate that sort of cinematic or movie feeling. So, of course, you don't need to talk about or bother to categorize like all of your arrows and iron rations and all that stuff. Instead, maybe, okay, I have an ancestrally important sword, right? Or I have a token that was given to me by my mother, right? Or I have, you could potentially write about some things that might not necessarily be considered all that important, like rope, right? But that could become cinematically or thematically necessary or appropriate. So either way, again, another thing you need to worry about is unless the item that you're talking about is incredibly expensive, you probably don't really need to worry about money either. And that pretty much wraps up VEN6. Again, this is a game that's really intended for one-shots or short games with requiring 0 prep and also not necessarily requiring any one individual person to basically take up the mantle as game master for your playing group. If you would like to learn a bit more, again, links will be found down below for the blog post, the system reference document on their Real Life Press website, and also the itch page store if you would rather download it that way. And also for, of course, all of the various links that you can see here for the things like the character sheet that we had previously used. Again, thank you for joining us. Don't forget to rate your itch purchases and have a good zone.